conversion to Islam, but what stands out in my mind now is that there was actually an American guy who had converted to Islam, lived in Saudi Arabia, and he came and lectured the class about Islam. And, you know, the entirety of his lecture, I couldn't even tell you, but there's just about 2 or 3 points that he made that just were additional seeds that were kind of planted in my heart at the time. One of those was the explanation of why Muslims do not believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that he doesn't look like a human being, and that he's above human beings, that he's the creator, so he doesn't resemble the creation. And he explained some of that, and to me, it really made me think about that a lot, because I remember even, you know, as a child and adolescent praying and thinking, do I pray to Jesus? Do I pray to God? Are they different? Are they the same? And he just made this very clear distinction that they're not the same. And that stood out in my mind. And then he also explained the hijab a little bit. I mean, he explained it in very sort of like romanticized terms, but...
But let me just ask you, before he began to explain that one, did you have some kind of idea or notion about the hijab yourself?
No, I had never even given it any thought, quite frankly.
Okay.
I think that in many ways I was a typical American, just sort of like out of sight, out of mind. You know, those are people that are different and they do their own thing. And, you know, at that time I thought, okay, you know, there's definitely a God, there's one God, and there's all these different religions, and they all have some truth and some falsehood. And nobody really knows the truth, nobody really knows, you know, it's just a bunch of made-up stuff, and some things are right and some things are wrong. And that's it. That was my own philosophy, and I actually hear that a lot repeated, you know, talking to people nowadays as well. So, you know, in terms of, you know, the hijab, I didn't even know that word, and I honestly don't think he may have even used that. If he did, I don't remember. But he said, you know, I mean, it's not necessarily true, but it just made me start thinking about, you know, okay, just because I do something a certain way that's different than somebody else doesn't mean that I'm right and they're wrong, or vice versa. It's just a different way of looking at things, a different perspective. And he said, you know, to Arabs, and he kind of put it more in like cultural terms rather than religious ones, that, you know, to us Arabs, you know, women are very beautiful, and, you know, we, even just their wrist is beautiful, you know, and so that's why they cover up. And it was very romanticized, and it wouldn't say it was a very religious perspective, but you know, he was like, you know, basically covering has to do with respecting the woman and respecting her sexuality, and it's not out there and wanton display for everybody to see and all of that. So in those terms, I was like, oh, that's an interesting perception. He's like, you know, it's not about shame, and because I think a lot of Americans feel like covering is that you're covering something that's shameful, you know, that sexuality is shameful. So the hijab specifically that he talked about in this lecture, you know, it wasn't in terms of hijab. It was much more of a cultural kind of interpretation of it, but it still was something that I thought about, you know, maybe not in religious terms, but just thought about it as, oh, this is another culture's perspective. And that maybe the way that we as Americans are perceiving this isn't the reality of what it really is. But, you know, again, it was a, you know, one quarter, one class, and I went on with my life, really. It wasn't until I was about 22 years old, so about 4 or 5 years later, I ended up meeting a bunch of students that were from Kuwait, and that is where I really started thinking about Islam. And
I mean, what was it about meeting those students that got you really thinking about Islam?
Well, you know, it's one thing to learn about Islam.
No, I'm sorry, let me ask you another question.
Okay.
Where were you at in your life that when you met the students, something about them was able to really be a catalyst for you to really start thinking about Islam? I mean, what was your life like at 22?
So at 22, I had graduated from college. I was still working, you know, in a retail job, and I hadn't really, you know, figured out what I was going to do with my life, to sound sort of cliche. I just was kind of plugging away, and, you know, I had debt from school, and, you know, I mean, I just wasn't really sure what I was doing, and I wasn't, you know, down and out or anything like that. I did have sort of a strained relationship with my mother at the time, but I think that's, you know, not uncommon for a lot of young women. So, And I wasn't, I also wasn't really super close with my sister. I have one sister. She's a year and a half younger than I am. But I mean, for the most part, I felt like I was fairly happy, and I was going out with friends, doing all things that American girls do, and I didn't feel like I needed some change in my life or anything.
Okay.
I had just graduated from college maybe 6 months before that, so I was still sort of kind of seeing where life was going to take me, and I met these students, and they weren't perfect Muslims. I'm not gonna say that, but they were living, for the most part, Muslim lifestyles. Praying and fasting, and when someone's really practicing Islam, it's a lifestyle. It's not just a belief. I mean, that obviously. So you can't help but to notice those things and just see them. I mean, just from the smallest things, like, anytime I would tell them, like, oh, this is, nice car. Oh, say mashallah, right? Some of those things, right? Or if I ask, oh, are we going to do this? Or can you help me with this? Inshallah, right? Never a yes. Always inshallah. So those things, those are the small examples. And then, bigger examples, there was a time when I really needed help financially, and, one of them helped me to buy a car, co-sign. I mean, this is someone I'm not even related to. I wasn't even Muslim at the time. I mean, he could have, whatever. He just was helpful, and, they would invite me and some of my friends over for dinner, and they'd have these big dinners, and just very, family oriented, and, this sense of kind of community, and there was never a us versus them or anything like that. And just, I think also, what's kind of struck me too was seeing them pray. It's just something so different than I'd never seen Muslims pray before, never, that I can remember. And to see, because they're mostly guy students, so to see these guys, men especially men, it's like women, I think, humbling yourself and submitting is more in tune, I think, a lot with the nature of being female. I mean, I think that's why you see this ratio of men to women converting in America. It's like for every one man, 4 women convert. I think that has a lot to do with, women being just much more in tune and being a little bit more introspective and all of that. But, to see these men who, in my American eyes, were like kind of macho or, bowing down. I mean, that was just something that just, psychologically speaking, definitely kind of rocked my world. Just to see that, I mean, I never saw such kind of devotion, even going to church. And, I mean, some people in my family are very religious Christians, and, very, like my grandmother, she just takes it very seriously. That's my grandmother. My grandfather wasn't very religious. My mother was more religious. My dad wasn't. So just to see these guys, that were young, 20-somethings, they could have been out, drinking and having fun, like, American guys. But no, they weren't doing that. They were, doing guy stuff, having fun and that. But at the same time, they're like going to the mosque every Friday. They're praying in communion, like at the house. And so I think that, just knowing them and seeing Islam as a lifestyle made me really start thinking about, what is Islam? And it wasn't until first, was knowing them. Then from knowing them and knowing about Islam, I started to defend Islam and defending Muslims.
And defending against whom and what
Just
types
like
of statements?
I had a lot of friends who just thought I was so crazy and stupid for being friends with these people, and they would tease me and joke with me, and these were kind of like my fair weather friends, right?
Yeah, right.
The ones that we'd go out with and have fun with, but they weren't my, real close friends. So, they would say things just jokingly, or in my family too. I mean, they just thought it was crazy that I, was friends with